I was talking to an engineering student the other day, and he brought up that famous XKCD comic that arranges academic fields by their purity. He had this incredibly confident, almost smug look as he explained it. It's simple, he said. Sociology is just applied psychology, which is just applied biology, which is just applied chemistry, which is just applied physics. It all boils down to the real fundamental laws. To him, the world was a clean, formal system. Concepts like social structure or cultural capital were just fuzzy, imprecise words for things that could, in theory, be reduced to particle physics. I let him finish, and then I asked him, okay, so use your framework to explain Black Lives Matter. The shift was fascinating. All that crisp certainty just crumbled. He started to talk about, the movement of bodies through space, the physics of crowds, but he knew how absurd it sounded. He stammered, his hands fidgeted. His entire elegant model of the universe had no language for history, for power, for symbolic justice, for why that specific video sparked a global firestorm. His pure science was utterly silent. That sudden, jarring silence, that complete inability of a supposedly fundamental truth to explain a fundamental human reality is precisely the space where sociology begins. It's not a failure to be pure. It's a commitment to engage with the world that physics was never meant to explain. Okay, so let's really unpack this for you today. This deep dive, it's all about pulling back the curtain on sociology. We're going to explore, why it's so different from those quote-unquote purer sciences, how it actually tackles the seemingly messy stuff of human experience, but meticulously, and crucially, how its unique insights are just absolutely essential for understanding and maybe even changing our world. It's about seeing the indispensable lens sociology offers you for making sense of everything around us. That whole encounter with the engineering student, and his take on that purity hierarchy, it really stuck with me. This idea that sociology is just like watered down psychology and so on down the line. It implies it's somehow less rigorous, maybe less fundamental, less scientific even. What do you make of that whole foundationalist view?
Well, it's an interesting way to frame it, but I think it fundamentally misunderstands how science actually works, especially when you look across different fields. That foundationalist vision, it paints this really neat, tidy picture, doesn't it? Suggesting everything just boils down to physics eventually. But think about math for a second. Mathematics abstracts for its own internal logical purity, right? It kind of detaches from the real world messiness. Its truths are built on axioms. They don't need to perfectly map onto empirical reality to be valid within mathematics. Sociology, though, it also abstracts, but it abstracts from, say, individual meanings. Not to get rid of them, but precisely to reveal complexity and patterns at a higher level. It's deeply, deeply rooted in lived experience, in history, in the whole social context. So instead of trying to avoid the messiness of human life, it actually dives right into it, trying to understand the structures within that messiness.
Right. So it's not about being less pure, maybe, but a different kind of rigor, a different way of abstracting. Like you take a geometric triangle. That concept exists universally, right? Whether you draw it or not, it's just there. But a sociological concept like alienation, that's not some universal constant. Its meaning, how it shows up, it changes dramatically depending on time, the culture, the power structures involved. So it sounds like sociological concepts aren't just deduced from some fixed laws, but they're kind of forged in the chaos of history, power, language itself. They emerge from really engaging with the social world.
You've absolutely hit on a crucial point there. And that brings us straight to the core problem with strict reductionism, that belief that you can just break down any complex thing into its simplest parts without losing anything important. Now, reduction as a tool, like using language to simplify or categorize, that can be necessary in lots of fields, biologists breaking down cells, chemists analyzing molecules. But a strict reductionist stance, especially in social sciences, is just deeply problematic. It inevitably strips away vital context, subjective meaning, history, those emergent properties you just mentioned. It tries to reduce complex human stuff to something it just isn't. It's like trying to understand a symphony by analyzing each individual note on the page, totally missing the melody, the harmony, the emotional punch of the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like that idea you sometimes hear floating around, trying to reduce the mind to just the brain. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the brain's the biological hardware, right? Mm-hmm. But if you only focus on the neurons firing, you risk losing the very essence of what it means to be human. Beliefs, identity, memories, love, fear. Consciousness itself, those aren't just like noise to filter out. That is the social system we're trying to get a handle on. You can't really capture the feeling of grief or falling in love just by mapping brain pathways, even though they're involved. You lose all the meaning.
Exactly. And this really highlights a fundamental misunderstanding when people demand that sociology has to meet the exact same standards as, say, physics. A physicist might be looking for universal laws governing the physical world. They often aim for what some philosophers call a perspectival objectivity, like a view from nowhere, trying to see things without any human bias, as if you could step outside it all. A sociologist, though, is looking for situated meanings, for patterns within these incredibly complex human interactions. And they're keenly aware that all understanding is shaped by context and perspective. Both are absolutely scientific endeavors, no question, but they're asking fundamentally different kinds of questions. They need different tools, and so they demand different but equally rigorous approaches.
I heard this powerful story that illustrates this perfectly. It was about a public health official working on a vaccination campaign. This was in a rural, kind of post-industrial American town. Her team, mostly epidemiologists, they had all the hard data. Infection rates, vaccine efficacy numbers, charts, logical facts, all laid out. They presented it all really clearly at town meetings explaining the science. But the community's resistance was just fierce. Deep suspicion, anger, people just refusing. And the team was completely baffled because from their purely scientific view, the logic was undeniable. The facts were the facts. The benefits seemed obvious.
And what's so insightful there is what happened next. The team, totally frustrated, they eventually brought in a sociologist. And this person had actually grown up in a similar kind of town. He didn't show up with more data or slicker presentations. Instead, he spent the first week just being there, quietly immersing himself at the diner, high school football games, church potlucks, just listening, really listening. And he learned the resistance wasn't actually about the vaccine science or people not understanding viruses. It was about this deep historical mistrust of outsiders, of authorities. People felt they'd been betrayed again and again over decades, factory closures, economic decline, broken promises, that whole post-industrial story. The real problem wasn't a lack of information. It was this fundamental lack of trust, rooted in their collective history and their current economic reality.
Wow. So armed with that deeper sociological insight, the team completely changed its approach. They stopped leading with the raw data, the scientific arguments. Instead, they figured out who the trusted local figures were. The town doctor everyone knew, the pastor of the biggest church, maybe a respected union leader from the oil factory. And they partnered with them to lead the conversation. These people, already trusted within the community, they became the ones sharing the information, bridging that gap of distrust that the pure science just couldn't cross on its own.
Yeah, and it just perfectly illustrates the flaw in that whole purity hierarchy idea. The epidemiology, the pure science, it correctly identified the biological threat, the facts. That was necessary, absolutely. But it was powerless to solve the human problem, the complex social historical context of why people were hesitant. It took that messier, more interdisciplinary sociological approach, blending history, economics, cultural understanding, to really get at the why behind the behavior and find a way forward. So to solve these really complex real-world problems, especially involving people, you don't necessarily need purer science. What you need is a fuller toolbox, right? A more diverse set of scientific perspectives that can actually grapple with the messiness and complexity of social life.
Okay, so we've talked about these external critiques, this whole purity thing. But it's important to say, too, that there are valid discussions and, frankly, self-critiques within social science itself. It's not like sociologists think everything's perfect. You hear about the publish or perish pressure, right? Debates around the replication crisis, whether studies can be easily reproduced. And Ongoing talks about how social science, well, it struggles to get the same kind of numerical precision or predictive power you see in physics or chemistry. Some people even question if objective truth is even possible in social contexts, or if it's all just interpretation, just social construction.
Those are absolutely vital discussions. They reflect, I think, a healthy self-awareness in the field. It's true that for many sociologists today, particularly those influenced by what we call post-positivism, the idea is that while an objective reality might exist out there, our human understanding of it is always filtered. It's mediated by our biases, our theories, our own limitations as observers. So truth in some absolute unmediated sense. That might ultimately be unknowable by humans. But that doesn't mean you give up. The goal shifts. It becomes less about finding the absolute truth and more about increasing the precision and the robustness of our knowledge. How? By recognizing and actively accounting for those inherent biases and limitations. That's a different kind of rigor, you see. It acknowledges the human element not as a flaw to be eliminated, but as part of the process. It's about building knowledge together, reflexively.
So it's not abandoning rigor, it's redefining it for the subject matter. And this actually leads to something really interesting I wanted to ask you about, complexity theory. I've heard it described as a kind of meta theory in sociology, not like a rigid theory or one specific method, but more like a framework, a way to understand how social things work, especially how big patterns emerge from lots of small interactions.
Absolutely. Complexity theory gives us a really different lens, moving beyond that simple linear cause and effect thinking we sometimes fall into. It posits that these big societal trends we see, like, say, persistent segregation in cities, or the way social movements suddenly take off, or even huge inequalities, they emerge from countless local interactions between what it calls semi-autonomous agents, individuals, groups, organizations. Think about Thomas Schelling's classic segregation model. It's fascinating. His simulations show that even if individuals have only a very slight preference for living near people like themselves, no grand racist plan, just a mild preference over time, that can lead to widespread residential segregation across a whole city. That's an emergent phenomenon. You can't reduce it back down to the intention of any single person. And these semi-autonomous agents, they're operating under certain rules or constraints, cognitive limits, social norms, emotions, creating these dense webs of interdependence and feedback loops that shape the whole system in ways that are often unpredictable but still patterned.
Ah, okay, so that highlights how, like, small initial things can have massive nonlinear effects down the road, right? A tiny change can ripple out hugely, like maybe a small informal breakfast program started by a couple of people for the homeless, and through feedback and adaptation, it accidentally grows into this huge ministry serving thousands, offering all sorts of services way beyond the original idea. Or feedback loops, positive or negative, they can amplify things or stabilize them, or how people adapt and learn, leading to stuff like social contagion, like a wave of applause sweeping through a concert hall. It's not planned, it just happens as people respond to those around them. It's a collective thing.
Precisely. This perspective helps us see social phenomena much more holistically, as these intricate dynamic systems. Take societal inequality. It's not just the result of one bad policy or one set of interactions. It often depends on the diffusion of a critical mass of interactions that then reinforce each other and amplify over time. And this approach, it demonstrates a really deep scientific rigor, actually. It's about finding patterns, understanding complex emergent dynamics, even if it doesn't fit that neat linear cause-effect model from some other sciences. It's a powerful way to make sense of the complex, sometimes unpredictable, but definitely pattern nature of social reality. It helps us avoid oversimplifying things.
Okay, so if sociology isn't chasing universal laws like physics, how does it maintain rigor when it's dealing with something as inherently, messy as subjective human experience? How do you rigorously study beliefs, identities, memories, feelings like love or fear? Things you can't really put in a test tube or quantify easily.
That's an excellent question, and really, it's central to the whole enterprise. For sociology, subjectivity isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's a fundamental domain. So the challenge is studying it with discipline, systematically. And one really powerful approach here is grounded theory, developed by Glaser and Strauss back in the day. Unlike traditional science that might start with a hypothesis like, if I do X, then Y will happen, grounded theory is systematically inductive. That means the theory is built directly from the data you gather and analyze. You let the theory emerge organically from what people are actually saying or doing, rather than trying to fit the data into a pre-existing box. Data collection and analysis happen iteratively, side by side, constantly informing each other. It's a bit like a detective piecing together clues, letting the story emerge from the evidence.
Right, so you're not going in with a fixed idea of what you expect to find. You might start with a broad question like, how do city dwellers feel about vegan pet food? And then you do what's called theoretical sampling, which isn't random, right? It's like you strategically choose who to talk to next or what situation to observe based on what your emerging theory needs to develop further. And you keep going, collecting data, interviews, observations, maybe online forums until you reach theoretical saturation. That's the point where new data isn't really adding anything substantially new to your theory. You feel like you've captured the core concepts and how they relate.
Precisely. And then comes the coding, which is far from just randomly labeling things. It's a very systematic, multi-stage process. You usually start with open coding, going line by line through your data, interview, transcripts, field notes, whatever. You identify distinct ideas, actions, thoughts, and assign conceptual labels or codes. So if people keep describing their pets as smart or clever, you might code that chunk of text as pet intelligence. It's exploratory. Then you organize these initial codes into broader categories and maybe subcategories. You look for connections, similarities, differences. Maybe you also coded instances of people talking about farm animal intelligence, perhaps conflictingly. Both could fall under a bigger category like perceptions of animal intelligence. Then, through what's called axial coding, you start linking these categories together. What causes what? Under what conditions? What are the strategies people use? What are the consequences? And finally, with selective coding, you identify a core category that ties everything together, that becomes the central storyline of your theory, ensuring it's all grounded in the data you collected. All along, you're doing constant comparison, comparing new data to old refining codes. It's systematic, and it creates a robust, evidence-based theory, even from qualitative data.
And there are checks and balances too, right? Like constant engagement with colleagues, peer review, and also this idea of reflexivity, which is about constantly thinking about your own biases, your own background, and how that might be shaping the research not to eliminate it, but to be aware of it and account for it. Sounds incredibly disciplined.
It is. And another vital tool for handling meaning is hermeneutics, which, simply put, is the study of interpretation. It has a really rich history, actually. It goes way back to ancient Greece, Plato, Aristotle thinking about how language conveys meaning. Then it got seriously applied in biblical studies, trying to understand divine texts. During the Enlightenment, it expanded to secular texts, law, history. Thinkers like Schleiermacher emphasized understanding not just grammar, but also the historical context. The goal became trying to reconstruct the author's original mindset, recognizing texts are products of their time.
Okay, interpreting ancient texts, historical documents, that makes sense. But how did that whole approach jump into sociology, into understanding modern society and what people do today?
Well, that's where people like Max Weber come in. Weber saw that the methods used in natural sciences focusing on objective measurement, cause and effect, just weren't enough for understanding human behavior. Because human actions aren't just events, they're packed with meaning, with intention. If someone raises their hand, like you said, is it a question, a signal, a greeting? The physical act is the same. The meaning is different. So Weber introduced Verstehen, this idea of interpretive understanding, emphasizing the need to grasp the subjective meanings people attach to their actions. This is a huge shift, really distinguishing the social sciences by allowing for a much deeper, more nuanced look at society, connecting individual actions to bigger social structures.
And then later in the 20th century, you get Hans-Georg Gadamer, who adds another layer, right? He argued that interpretation can never be fully objective because the interpreter is always shaped by their own historical and cultural context, their historically affected consciousness, he called it. He talked about a fusion of horizons, where the interpreter's world meets the world of the text or the social phenomenon, creating new understanding. So interpretation isn't about finding one fixed meaning, it's more like an ongoing dialogue, never really finished.
Exactly right. And in sociology today, this applies directly to understanding how individuals and groups make sense of their social worlds. Through symbols, rituals, language, shared understandings. Social life is interpretation in many ways. Ethnographic research, for example, which is a cornerstone method, involves the researcher immersing themselves in a cultural setting. The goal is to interpret the meanings people attach to their actions from their perspective, while also explicitly reflecting on how the researcher's own background shapes that interpretation. It's also super useful for analyzing things like political speeches or viral memes or online discourse. You go beyond the literal words to understand the underlying messages, how power is being used through language, and how different groups interpret and maybe resist those messages.
This reminds me of a case study I read about, this young woman, Elena. She moved from a small village in Italy to Berlin for a tech job. In her village, life was all about these dense, unspoken social rules, stuff built up over generations, things everyone just knew. But Berlin was completely different, explicit, efficient, individualistic. Simple things like making small talk at work or figuring out if a coffee invitation was genuinely social or just polite. It was totally baffling to her. She felt like her personality, which was vibrant back home, just flattened out. And her coding skills, her tech job, that didn't help her navigate this human social maze at all.
And this raises that crucial question again. How do you apply rigor to something so intangible, so subjective, so cultural? The sociologist Elena met. She didn't give her a list of rules like do this, don't do that. Instead, she taught Elena a method. Participant, observation, a classic ethnographic technique. Elena learned to keep this detailed, systematic journal. Not just about her feelings, those were important, but objective observations. Her boss's posture in meetings, what people talked about at lunch, how humor landed, subtle body language cues. Then they analyzed this journal together using sociological concepts like high context versus low context cultures or social scripts or cultural capital to make sense of her experiences.
Okay, so that's where it gets really interesting. For the first time, Elena started seeing her struggles not as her own personal failing, but as this collision between two different complex but equally valid social systems, each with its own logic, its own invisible rules. The rigor wasn't in finding a simple formula, but in that process, the systematic observation, the detailed recording, the interpretive analysis of that really subtle, subjective human world she was in. That's a fundamentally different kind of scientific discipline, isn't it? But just as powerful in providing clarity, it gave her a way to see the invisible forces at play.
Yeah, and this whole objectivity question in qualitative work, especially ethnography, well, it's complex and heavily debated. Some argue you should maybe even ditch the terms subjective and objective altogether in this kind of research. They emphasize immersion, involvement, that being part of the situation is how you understand it. Others try to redefine objectivity to mean things like being really alert, open to other views, maybe empathetic understanding, rather than detached neutrality. And then you still have some who argue quite strongly that qualitative research is just as objective as physics, aiming for a true description of reality, just using different tools.
But there's a really important distinction we need to make here, isn't there, between the kind of subjectivity that's damaging, like, a researcher deliberately ignoring data that contradicts their pet theory, or worse, making stuff up. That's just fraud. But then there's the subjectivity that's unavoidable and maybe even valuable. The fact that every researcher brings their unique perspective, their knowledge, their background, their worldview to the table. We don't observe like blank slates.
Absolutely. That's a critical distinction. Philosophers of science like Kuhn and Hansen talked about observations being inherently theory-laden. We don't just passively see things, we see as something. Think about those optical illusions, like the duck-rabbit picture. You can see it as a duck or as a rabbit, but usually not both at the exact same time. Our theories, our background knowledge, our assumptions, they influence what we even notice, what we select to observe out of infinite possibilities, and definitely how we interpret it. Data isn't truly neutral because it's always selected and framed through some lens.
Okay, but if our observations are always infected by our theories, and if that view from nowhere, objectivity, isn't really achievable in social science, does that mean we just throw up our hands? Does it lead to total relativism where any interpretation is as good as any other?
That's a common worry, but no, I don't think it leads to total relativism at all. While that old school absolute objectivity might be elusive for complex social stuff, basic observational facts like there are 6 people in this room, those are generally things we can agree on for practical purposes through our shared human ways of reasoning. The point isn't necessarily to find the single absolute truth, which might just not exist for some social phenomena. Instead, it's about increasing objectivity. How? By getting multiple perspectives, by triangulating our understanding, using different methods, maybe combining interviews with surveys or historical analysis or what's some called crystallization, looking at the same thing from multiple theoretical angles. This isn't just about double-checking. It's about adding more light, making the picture richer, more nuanced, and ultimately more robust because it's less dependent on any single viewpoint. It's a very pragmatic way to build knowledge.
So, moving beyond understanding individual experiences and interactions, sociology also offers this really critical lens for diagnosing and maybe even addressing some of our biggest societal challenges, especially things like systemic injustice, deep-seated inequalities. It helps us see beyond just blaming individuals, right?
Definitely. That's a huge part of what sociology does. And central to that is understanding power dynamics. Michel Foucault, for instance, had this incredibly influential idea that power isn't just something elites hold and wield from the top down. He saw it as more diffuse, like a network, exercised through all sorts of mechanisms, surveillance, discipline, how knowledge itself is produced and controlled. It operates everywhere, in prisons, schools, hospitals, even in our daily habits. It's subtle, often invisible. And then you have Pierre Bourdieu, who gave us the concept of symbolic power. That's the power to shape how people see the world, to impose meanings and categories that often benefit the dominant groups. This works subtly through things like cultural capital, your education, your tastes, how you speak, social capital, your networks, and of course, economic capital. These things shape behavior, often unconsciously, making existing hierarchies seem natural or inevitable.
Right, and these aren't just abstract ideas. This power shows up in concrete ways. It can be coercive using force. It can be persuasive using influence. It can be authoritative based on legitimacy. And all these forms contribute to major societal outcomes like inequality, conflict, the marginalization of whole groups, often without anyone needing to be overtly discriminatory.
Exactly. And a really crucial concept in contemporary sociology for understanding this is intersectionality, coined initially by Kimberly Crenshaw. It highlights how different systems of power based on race, gender, class, sexuality, disability, and so on don't operate separately. They intersect and compound. So an individual's experience, say a Black woman's experience, isn't just the sum of racism plus sexism. It's a unique experience shaped by the intersection of those systems, facing compounded forms of disadvantage that looking at race or gender alone would totally miss. It gives us a much more powerful and accurate way to understand and tackle these deep-rooted social problems.
There was a story I read online, it really drove this home for me, about a young Black lawyer, David, at a top London law firm. He was brilliant, doing great work, but just completely exhausted. And not just from the long hours. It was the constant drip, drip, drip of small things. Colleagues commenting, wow, you're surprisingly articulate, being the only person of color in a meeting and always being asked to take notes. Clients assuming he was the paralegal, not the lawyer. Each thing felt too small, too ambiguous to make a formal complaint about. He started wondering, am I just being too sensitive? Am I imagining this? Feeling kind of gaslighted by the environment?
And what's so insightful about his story is how he connected with a Black British sociologist, maybe through a mentoring program or something. And this sociologist introduced him to terms like microaggression and systemic bias, not just as buzzwords, but as analytical tools. This framework helped David see that these weren't random, isolated incidents of maybe awkwardness or individual prejudice. They were symptoms of a larger, often invisible structure within the firm. A culture built on unexamined assumptions about race, about competence, that subtly shaped everyday interactions. Who got seen, who got heard, who felt like they belonged. It made the hidden rules visible.
And that knowledge, just having that framework, was incredibly liberating for him. It wasn't his fault. He wasn't imagining it. What he was experiencing was a documented social pattern, a form of subtle but cumulative discrimination. And it turned his quiet frustration into focused action. He and some other junior lawyers from minority backgrounds used this sociological understanding to put together a formal report for the partners. It wasn't just based on feelings, it was based on documenting these patterns and showing their systemic impact on retention, on morale, on promotion prospects. And they proposed concrete changes like blind reviews or different ways of assigning work to try and mitigate those biases.
That story perfectly demonstrates the power of applying a sociological lens. Before he had that framework, the burden felt entirely personal. It's my problem. I need to toughen up.
Sociology gave him the tools to deconstruct what was actually happening, to zoom out from his individual feelings, to see the systemic reality of bias within that institution. It provides a language to make the invisible visible, right?
Yeah.
To name and analyze these subtle but powerful forces. And it's not about blaming individuals necessarily. It's about accurate diagnosis, which then allows you to turn that personal pain into a catalyst for real structural change.
Yeah, and thinking back to that Black Lives Matter example from the very beginning, it's so clear that physics, chemistry, they just had nothing to say about why that specific video ignited a global movement. It took sociology to provide the language of history, of power, of symbolic justice, collective trauma, the whole systemic nature of racism itself, how it's baked into institutions, laws, everyday habits, way beyond just individual prejudice. Exactly. Sociology's unique contribution there is its ability to reveal the systemic racism that often gets masked by narratives of individual incidents or a few bad apples. It helps us see the unequal distribution of vulnerability, how some communities are constantly under surveillance and face disproportionate violence, while harm to others is ignored or normalized. It helps analyze that choreography of authority, how state violence is made to seem routine or even justified. And crucially, it also illuminates the symbolic power of resistance, how grief and outrage get channeled into collective action that challenges dominant meanings and demands fundamental change.
So what does this mean for you, listening to this? The power of sociology isn't just in diagnosing the problems. It's in insisting that real understanding has to come before effective transformation. It makes these complex systems understandable, legible, not just describing them, but analyzing them critically. You can't effectively fight racism, for example, without first understanding how deeply it's woven into laws, culture, policies, economic structures, even our unconscious habits. You can't dismantle systemic inequality without grasping the actual mechanisms that keep reproducing it, things like tax codes or zoning laws that segregate communities, or how cultural capital gives advantages to some kids over others. Without that deep sociological insight, wanting change is just a nice idea. It's not a real strategy.
And connecting back briefly to complexity theory can also help us understand how power and inequality emerge from these local interactions and then solidify at higher levels of society. It offers a kind of weak systems view, incorporating power, interests, status, without assuming everything serves some neat function. Think about those agent-based models of labor markets, for instance. Simulations show how even a relatively small bias, like employers having an unconscious preference that leads them to offer, say, a 25% lower starting wage to women than equally qualified men, on average can snowball over time into significant persistent gender pay gaps and segregated job queues across the whole economy. It shows how systemic injustice can reproduce itself even if overt discrimination disappears. It really highlights the need for that nuanced, fine-grained analysis of bias and its complex emerging consequences. Small things can add up to huge self-sustaining patterns.
So ultimately, when you pull it all together, sociology really occupies this unique and frankly indispensable position. It's the discipline that's uniquely equipped to hold all these tensions between the subjective and the structural, the personal and the political, the empirical data and the interpretation. It's sometimes even called the mirror science because it turns its lens back on knowledge production itself, analyzing how other fields get funded, how expertise gets defined and recognized, how authority is built into institutions, including universities and science itself.
And yeah, it's important to acknowledge there are legitimate criticisms within the field, concerns about dense jargon that makes it inaccessible, sometimes perceptions of political bias, or even intellectual echo chambers. But those challenges should prompt reflection, refinement, vigorous debate, not wholesale dismissal. Sociology's enduring value, its empirical rigor seen in large-scale surveys, sophisticated statistical modeling, longitudinal studies that track change over decades that really speaks for itself. Its core insights continue to resonate deeply with anyone trying to genuinely understand the human condition and our complex social world.
And honestly, in the world we live in right now with information overload, intense polarization, algorithms shaping so much of our lives, the need for this kind of deep sociological thinking feels greater than ever. We don't need purity in that old reductionist sense of breaking everything down. What we need is more reflexivity, examining our own assumptions, more humility when facing complex problems, and way more attention to those intricate systems of meaning that both connect us and tragically divide us. We need to see the invisible rules governing our lives.
Sociology is definitely not perfect. No field is. But it's indispensable precisely because it dares to study what disciplines like physics or math, just by their nature, aren't designed to study. The messy, unruly, constructed, constantly fought over nature of human social life. If physics gives us equations for motion, sociology gives us a language to decode social movements, movements of people, yes, but also movements of power, of memory, of ideas. It helps us understand how norms shape us, how institutions channel us, how even the search for order can subtly limit our possibilities. It teaches us to ask not just what is true, but also true for whom and why now.
And what's also compelling, something for you to think about, is how even a field like engineering, often placed at the opposite end of that purity scale, actually works with sociology constantly. While sociology uncovers these structures of meaning and power, engineering often materializes them, implements them, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously in the design of our cities, the algorithms shaping our feeds, our infrastructure, the technologies impacting our environment. They might not always speak the same language, but they are absolutely building and operating in the same shared social spaces. Sociology's commitment to digging deep, to critical analysis, it reveals the patterns and pathways not just for understanding, but for genuinely transforming our social world towards something more just and equitable.